Great, excellent. And I, just for the organizers, will move the slides on based on next slide, please. So, okay, you jumped ahead of it there a bit, but anyway, so thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm Martin Charter from the Center for Sustainable Design at UCA being the second largest provider of graduates to the creative industry in Europe. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is around designing for the circular economy. So a lot of discussion around the terms, but it's important to recognize that sustainable development is still, the core concept that overrides everything, as exemplified by the SDGs here. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. But it's important to then recognize that the circular economy touches a number of the SDGs, and this relationship is important to understand, because you certainly see in certain organizations or even some countries that there is this sort of mindset going on where people are thinking that almost circular economy is taking over from sustainable development, and that's certainly not my view. It nests within a broader approach to sustainable development. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as we've seen here, this is using Google Trends. We've seen a significant growth in the searching of the term circular economy over the last 7 or 8 years, and still very ill-defined as a term. And indeed now ISO, International Standards Organization, are now working on a one new standard of 4 that is looking to define the terms around circular economy and the concepts more clearly. This builds on existing 3 other standards that have been developed in the UK, France, and Brazil. Next slide, please. But it's also important to recognize that, particularly, and John Elkington may have talked about this, is that issues go in waves, over the years. Certainly in Rio, the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, there was no discussion over climate change. There was no discussion over circular economy. But we saw in the 2000s significant discussion going on in relation to climate change emerging. Everybody talking about low carbon, companies starting to focus on low carbon. But it's important to remember the big picture. In effect, sustainable development, the focus is on the environmental, the social, and the economic aspect. And it's important not just to get too locked into the key trends of that moment in time. Next slide, please. So perspective is everything. Next slide, please. And what we're going to increasingly see is this linkage between approaches towards a transition to a more circular economy, and the linkage is there with climate change. And at the moment, in many ways they've been seen as separate, but the interrelationships with the two, will need to be increasingly understood and demonstrated. Next slide, please. So obviously, 1 year on, coronavirus has thrown many things out. And next slide, please. This has led to a lot of confusion in whether it's across business, government, civil society. And next slide, please. And actually has led to perhaps one fundamental shift in many ways. Prior to the pandemic hitting us, many consultancies and think tanks were really talking about what was encapsulated as 3 mega trends. And this was most brilliantly brought together in this book by Thomas L. Friedman called Thank You for Being Late. And those 3 trends were acceleration of technological advancement, acceleration of concerns around environmental issues, and acceleration of globalization. But what we've really seen coming out of the pandemic is really potentially this development of more what we would term block economies, as manufacturing is being brought back from parts of Asia, to other parts of the world. So next slide, please. So what we may start to see is this more globalized approach that's sort of some things operating globally, but other aspects coming much more back into regions and localities. And particularly if we're thinking about a circular economy approach, working at a regional level is absolutely essential in terms of the various loops that I'll come back to. Next slide, please. So, and what's different in the discussions around the, let's call it the regeneration packages that are being discussed post-pandemic compared to 2008 and the global economic, after the global economic banking crisis, is that, you know, low carbon is in those discussions, circular is in those discussions, and social inclusivity is in those discussions. So the likelihood is that, you know, the in the green regeneration packages that are going to be implemented, that these, you know, low carbon and circular are going to be in this, and we're seeing this particularly interestingly as the US has you know, last year left the Paris Accord and rejoined it, and particularly now, you know, Joe Biden really looking to accelerate the low carbon economy in the US. Next slide, please. We looked at a lot of these issues in a recent piece of work we did that's feeding into the G20, looking at the state of the art of circular economy. And one of the key issues that emerged across the, you know, pretty more all the G20 economies was particularly new initiatives are emerging around ocean marine plastics. And we can see already the Seaspiracy movie documentary is launched about a week ago and has hit the top 10 in Netflix, really bringing out as one aspect of that complexity of the impact on the oceans, the impact of ocean marine plastics and some of the things that we're more familiar with, packaging, straws, etc. But also they bring out the whole issue of waste fishing gear. And through another project that I have not got time to talk to about today, this is an area of the ocean marine plastics issue is not discussed as significantly, but from various research that is not concrete at this stage, could represent by weight up to between 10 and 70% of all ocean marine plastics by weight. So this whole issue of ocean marine plastics is at a policy level going right up the agenda. Next slide, please. And really, we do see this link increasingly emerging between materials use and climate change. So the G20 countries are responsible for more than 2/3 of global material use, and the growth rate is higher than the rest of the world. Following current trends, material use in the G20 countries will increase from around 65 billion tons in 2015 to over 140 tons if we progress in the same way by 2050. And quite clearly, you know, this is unsustainable in its true sense. If we're continue to be taking stuff out of the ground without, you know, developing better systems, you know, to keep that resources in the loops in various forms. So next slide, please. So circular economy approaches could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 60%. This is referred to in our paper that will be published very soon. So there is a direct linkage, and I can show that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So very much at an organizational, you know, at a company level, and at least in my perspective, we talk about circular economy at the level of the company and the organization and business units, processes and products. And indeed, we now have standards activity starting under something called ISO TC 323. 6 now standards, actually, 2 new standards starting at an international level of this. But essentially for me, circular economy or product circularity is very much about retaining value in products, materials, and components. It's about a value discussion. Next slide, please. And not a waste discussion. So it's very much a value discussion. Next slide, please. And it's really about extending the life cycle of products and components and materials. And it's really putting the end of life in life cycle terms much further down the line. Next slide, please. And really, it is really about taking an approach at various levels, whether it be government or company or other levels, to design proactivity for that circularity. Next slide, please. And many of us will have seen, who've got into this, the idea that within the circular economy, we're operating within the biological system by using biological nutrients, wood, fibers, natural growing fibers, and then also within the technical nutrient, using technical nutrients in a technical system, metals, plastics, etc. And what we found when we were writing the BS 8001, the first standard that really looked at implementing circular economy in organization, a lot more discussion around the technical side, the technical nutrients rather than biological nutrients. And this is something that is now being addressed in the new ISO standard being developed. But a key part of this, in many ways, this is still very simplistic. That if we look at many products that are on the market, they're a combination of both technical and biological products. So we may increasingly see, if we look at other trends going to the future, technological acceleration, issues like wearable technologies, we may have a garment made out of organic cotton, but that's then got electronics integrated into it. So how do we deal with this in the loops and the end of life? Next slide, please. So again, this issue is really exemplified by this case here of, they're called Healthy Seas socks. And in one way, it's moving in the right direction. So this includes organic cotton, includes elastomer, and a significant proportion of something called EcoNile, which is a second life fiber, nylon fiber made from waste fishing gear. So it includes 3 materials. So in one sense, it's moving in the right direction. But if you come to the end of life, it's waste because you can't separate out those materials. So we need to look at also the technologies and approaches to allow the separability of the materials, at different stages of the life cycle. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So again, we see mixed materials here. If we look at, upcycled products, that again, when we wrote BS 8001, there was no definition in laws or standards of what upcycling means. But essentially, I always use this example. We have a company called Elvis and Cressy. They effectively had picked up waste fire hoses and then, have created bags that they sell into Harrods. But you look at, those bags there, that includes probably metals, leather, and maybe even polymer coatings there. So it's, it's an example of a sort of one level, a more circular product in that it's extending the life of materials, but it also then got mixed materials in it. And how do you tackle that? Next slide, please. And what we're seeing is some major companies now starting to really take much more concrete approaches to circular economy. You have Philips, for example, at the product level, they had a very grooved approach to looking at the eco-design of their products that they started in the 90s. And really over the last 3 or 4 years, they've actually changed their so-called 6 focal areas of eco-design and have now replaced a couple of those, or at least one of those focal areas with a new focal area of circularity. And they're then looking at, how do we design the product to be serviceable in the first life, but also, other further lives. Next slide, please. We also have, EcoNile that I mentioned further in the materials sphere. So this is, a second life depolymerized, repolymerized material. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We also see Lego now advertising positions in circular design. So I've got a 2-minute warning. I think I have about 4 minutes. So next slide, please. So again, we've got entrepreneurs emerging in this area. And what we're seeing, and if I picked up from the earlier discussion, we're certainly seeing younger millennials, Generation Z, really starting to integrate sustainability and circularity as the DNA of their businesses. And we're seeing a whole range of new companies, emerging. Next slide, please. So, for example, in the technical sphere, we have a company called iFixit. And effectively, their business is showing people using high-quality tutorials how to fix products and then they sell the tools to enable people to fix products. Next slide, please. Then we've got a company called BioBeam that was a spin out from a university architect actually who actually recognized the calorific value in coffee waste and produced coffee logs or logs for heating and housing made out of coffee waste. Next slide, please. But again, we're seeing other new interesting entrepreneurs emerging. For example, we've got Deserto, and this is a company that's producing so-called vegan leather that is made from cactus. But this is an area where there's still mixed materials. Some of these so-called vegan leathers are including polymers. Next slide, please. And we're seeing a paradigm shift. Certainly in the technology side, so-called Industry 4.0. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So this is going on at a high level. But what we're also seeing, which is perhaps less well acknowledged, is a potential reindustrialization that's emerging at a local level that's much more decentralized and has the potential to be more low carbon and circular. Next slide, please. And this is really emerging from the grassroots. Next slide, please. And this is a new movement of makers, modifiers, and fixers. People who want to make stuff, want to fix stuff, and modify stuff. Next slide, please. And this has been highlighted in influential magazines like Wired, etc. Next slide, please. And some of the empowering areas for this are the variety of videos that are now going online that enable people to show them how to physically make, modify, or fix products. So this is enabling people through the visual aspect rather than a sort of 10-point, 20-point manual in 8 points. So video is very important. Next slide, please. But also make places and spaces to enable making, modifying, fixing. These include maker spaces, hacker spaces, repair cafes. Next slide, please. So we're particularly focusing in the last part of the presentation on repair cafes. This emerged really from the Netherlands about 10 years ago. Essentially, these are community workshops where people are repairing a variety of different products, from electronics to mechanical, bicycle clothing, and furniture. And there's been quite a significant growth in these over the last few years. Next slide, please. And really what you've got is a tremendous sense of people giving back, individual repairing, customers working with repairers. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And really, I know a little bit about this because I've been participated in 3 of the first global surveys in repair cafes, and I founded one, which we're now 60 sessions down the line. So effectively, these repair cafes are having significant impact. So we measure everything in our repair cafe. We actually have a 66% repair rate. We also weigh products to identify how much is diverted from landfill, potentially through the extent of the life of the product through repair, but also the carbon emissions. But also importantly, the savings that are made for citizens through repair. We're up beyond £100,000 worth, even in our 40,000 citizen town. Next slide, please. The last few slides here. So what we've also developed is the world's first free calculator tool to work out the carbon savings associated with repairs. And we're actually just about to launch a version 2 of this. Next slide, please. And so that actually shows this linkage between repair, one strategy within circular economy, and CO2, and reducing CO2 emissions by retaining value in the system. So what we also done is pioneered the use of 3D printing for repair by doing customized repairs for a range of products. Next slide, please. But it's important to recognize that these repair cafes, yes, they're about repair. Yes, they're about that environmental impact. But what's come out very strongly from our experience and our research is it's very much about that social dimension, the community dimension, people coming together with a shared person. So really, it does really come back to the whole issue of the repair cafes. They have got an economic and environmental and a social impact. Next slide, please. So just in closing here, a very nice example of some of this. We ran a networking webinar, and we had a 70-year-old grandfather who was training his young 11-year-old grandson in repair, and the grandson repaired a light online live in our session. So this is this very nice intergenerational aspect of the need to pass the skills down. So the social dimension of this very much linked to this. So I think next slide, and I thank you very much.